Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting South Korea and Indonesia. What's topping his agenda? Pentagon threatens to cut federal funding to 30 universities over Chinese research ties. How Washington is turning science into a new Cold War battleground. U.S. national debt tops $40 trillion for the first time in history. How much longer can you sustain this debt-driven economy? Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story. Visiting Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has expressed hope that South Korea will pursue a friendly policy toward China and work to strengthen bilateral ties. Wang made the remark Thursday during a meeting with the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. He said the 35th anniversary of diplomatic relations next year would provide an opportunity to further advance the China-South Korea strategic cooperative partnership. The South Korean president said closer strategic cooperation is conducive to the interests of the two countries, as well as regional peace and stability. The South Korean president also said he looks forward to attending the APEC economic leaders meeting in Shenzhen this November and working with China to further advance their strategic partnership. So to delve into this, let's bring in Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Thanks for joining us, Einar.
Thank you, Anna.
Einar, Wang Yi's visit to South Korea comes just 7 months after President Lee Jae-myung's visit to China, with the two countries' leaders exchanging visits within less than 6 months. What does the timing of Wang's visit tell us about Beijing and Seoul's priorities, and what's China hoping to achieve?
Well, the next scheduled meeting was actually for the APEC in November. This meeting that he's going to now was only announced on the 18th of this month. So it might be in reaction to what the U.S. has been doing in terms of pulling back, the statements by Donald Trump about how he's so friendly with young Kim. And also, as he said, he's already pulled back on the number and the substance of these military joint ventures. So, both sides have an interest in stabilizing the relationship. There's been political and economic friction, but South Korea is in this interesting position where they're less and less enamored with the way the U.S. is treating them. I mean, it's tariffs. It's as if they're not friends. So this kind of unreliability factor is very much in their mind. And as they try to get into a dialogue with North Korea, there's some thoughts that Donald Trump is concerned about somebody else taking credit for a peace move when he said he was never going to allow North Korea to have nukes. He doesn't really talk about that. It just talks about the friendship. So you have a situation where, yes, South Korea is not going to walk away from its military or security arrangements with the U.S., but neither are they going to walk away from China. And this is related to the second topic in terms of Indonesia. You have two countries that are trying to balance. They don't want to choose sides. And actually, that's to China's benefit. It's the United States that says, no, you have to be with us and you have to cooperate with us against China. But both of them have very, very solid economic interests that they're going to continue pursuing. They just have to figure out how to balance it.
Mm-hmm. Einar, let's dive into this U.S. factor first, because China-South Korea relations are improving under the strategic direction set by the two leaders. But South Korea remains deeply tied to the U.S. security alliance and continues to cooperate with Washington on technology restrictions targeting China. So how do you elaborate Seoul's China policy today?
Well, it's really about how you balance these powers. I mean, China's South Korea's biggest economic trading partner. It cannot walk away from that. These are not the times. This is not a go-go period. And there's so many things going on, the supply chain disruptions, economic downturns, and then, of course, the conflicts going on in the world. At the same time, South Korea, they feel that as a smaller country, that they need to have some sort of nuclear umbrella and security guarantees, especially vis-a-vis North Korea. But that's where it gets interesting. If in fact they do come to terms with North Korea, whether the U.S. is part of it or not, it would stabilize the entire region. That would be something very much in China's interest. It may not be in the U.S. interest, despite this idea of talking about peace. In North Korea, South Korea, where there's no friction, North Korea has been normalized. It started trading with other countries. This would change the face of Northeast Asia. Japan would have to rethink this idea that there are all these threats from China or North Korea. So it would be very much a game changer if he's able to do this.
On the possibility of U.S. North Korea's talks, Wang Yi said the issue should be decided by Washington and Pyongyang while urging the U.S. to change its long-standing hostile policy toward North Korea. How likely will that happen? And what's your take on the response? And how should we understand China's position here?
Well, frankly, as I said before, China is in favor of anything that creates stable things. They're not going to get in between or say, oh, we have to be part of the talks between North Korea and the U.S. Anything that can happen that, lessens hostilities is going to be very, very, very beneficial.
Wang Yi also called on South Korea, based on its fundamental interests, to pursue an independent foreign policy and develop relations with other countries in parallel without conflict. So given Washington's pressure on Seoul, and earlier you mentioned, how much strategic autonomy can South Korea exercise these days?
Well, it's becoming more and more as the U.S. is perceived to be less and less reliable. South Korea has to start looking out for what are its interests, not simply to blindly follow the U.S. Against their own economic interests, and still when you're relying on somebody, but you then think, well, I don't think they're reliable, it's going to mean that South Korea is going to be looking more independently. They're going to diversify. They're going to look at the strategic options. Obviously, the first, foremost, and most rational one is to eliminate a threat, which means making peace with North Korea.
Turning back to China-South Korea ties, how would you assess the current economic relationship between the two, with both sides looking to expand cooperation in trade and investment, high technology, and AI? Where do you see the biggest potential for a real breakthrough?
Well, obviously technology sharing is there, but the U.S. has, put a kibosh on that. They say we don't want you to do that. So there's going to have to be areas where they can cooperate. Obviously, China is a huge market for South Korean goods. There are a lot of factories in South Korea South Korean factories in China that are producing intermediate goods that are sent to Korea and other places. So it's a question of how you thread the needle. The U.S. is going to consistently say, don't trade with China, don't do anything advanced, involving technology with China. But it isn't practical. We're living in a digital age. The idea that somehow South Korea just is going to cut itself off from a major market and a major production area is kind of silly. I mean, the fact is that one of China's strongest points, although when it talks about technology and everything like that, is the fact that it makes most of the intermediate goods. Whether you need chemicals or screws or bolts, assembly parts, plastics, you name it, it's made in China, and it isn't made anywhere else. That's the main issue. So you can't walk away from that. The question is, how do you build on it? How does South Korean ingenuity come up with new products that would be attractive not only to China, but globally?
After South Korea, Wang Yi will visit Indonesia for the first China-Indonesia Comprehensive Strategic Dialogue and the second Foreign and Defense Ministers 2+2 meeting. What does the establishment and deepening of these mechanisms tell us about the current level of China-Indonesia strategic trust?
Well, there's been some up and downs lately. Obviously, the previous administration had said that they wanted to have more downstream involvement. They just didn't want to sell their nickel ore as a commodity. They wanted to process it. Within the nickel ore itself, you have gold, you have silver, you have other rare oxides, even rare earths. So if you can process them in Indonesia, there's extra value plus jobs and everything like that. Chinese companies went in. Unfortunately, now they feel under pressure because there's this desire to, in essence, nationalize these industries. And some Chinese companies have literally left because they felt that that was not the deal. There's been about $12 billion worth of investment in these different processing facilities. And I think that's part of what's going on here is, once again, you have Indonesia. They're being pressured by the U.S. They don't want to take sides. The U.S. is pressuring to do so, whereas China is just saying, hey, let's trade. We're good partners. If you start, it's trade between the China and Indonesia over the past 8 years has gone up by 250%. This is an amazing amount. And it goes to show you where the vitality is. ASEAN is, Indonesia is part of ASEAN, but Indonesia is doing much better than many of the other groups in ASEAN. Question is, how do you, once again, thread this needle? Just like with South Korea, it's not so much about security, but in this particular case, about these kind of geopolitical pressures.
Thanks, Einar, for those insightful analysis. That was Einar Tengen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Coming up, Pentagon threatens to cut federal funding to 30 universities over Chinese research ties. This is World Today. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Yan Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
This is World Today. The U.S. Department of Defense has ordered 30 universities to review their partnership with what it calls foreign entities of concern or risk losing future federal research funding. Harvard, MIT, Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, and Cornell are among the universities ordered to conduct the reviews. They have until the end of this month to submit their assessments to the Pentagon. The order follows the Pentagon's release last month of an updated list of 130 academic and research institutions in China, Russia, and Iran. The department says ties with these institutions could increase the risk of U.S.-funded research being misappropriated. For more on this, Xue Wen spoke with Harvey Zoding, former vice president of ABC TV Network and senior fellow of the Center for China and Globalization.
Harvey, the Pentagon has ordered 30 U.S. universities, including Harvard, MIT, Johns Hopkins, the UC Berkeley, and so on, to review and potentially terminate certain research partnerships with institutions from China, Russia, and Iran. Why do you think Washington has chosen to target these specific 30 universities at this moment?
At this moment, that's a good qualifier. I think it's to divert attention from the many failures of the Trump administration. They're not winning the war with Iran that America started. They're losing in so many other places. In a recent poll, Pew Research Center shows that people throughout the world view China much more highly for the first time than the U.S. So I think the matter of timing is to try to regain the lost territory. But it also has to do with the fact that President Trump has been talking about communists in America. I think it's an attempt to demonize China, keep China down, contain China, especially as every day we get very much closer to the midterm congressional elections, which forecasts now that President Trump and the Republicans could lose one or both houses of Congress.
Then could you elaborate more on why these 30 universities, and also does the policy reflect concerns about specific partnerships or a broader shift in Washington's approach toward international academic cooperation?
Well, these 30 universities are not just drawn out of a hat. These happen to be the top universities, the top research universities in the United States of America. And so targeting them is really a no-brainer. I believe that the purpose of doing this is to both show the American public that U.S. is tough on China, also to show the American public that the U.S. is decoupling from China, and also to break the supply chains, the intellectual supply chains that run between the two countries, because we've had a long history of cooperation and we've solved many problems globally since especially 1979 and the reform and opening up. So I think there are both specific concerns, and I think it's right for countries to be concerned about security. But these measures go well beyond security. They're attempting to build, well, let's call it a reverse Great Wall to keep China locked in and not continuing to innovate as it has for the last decade since reform and opening up.
The Pentagon argues that these measures are necessary to prevent technology leakage and protect national security, but critics warn that expanding the concept of national security into academic and scientific cooperation could politicize normal research exchanges between countries, for instance, between China and the US. So how do you assess the real motivations behind this policy?
I think it's important for all countries to protect its national interests and to protect its national security. And there are instances where that needs to be done with great specificity. But I think here what the Trump administration is attempting to do is basically throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're going with a very wide net cast, and they're trying to shut down the cooperation that's been very robust in the past, and trying to score domestic political points. I think it's nothing more or less than that. And I think it's really a pity. Why? We face so many problems these days that we could be working on together. So let me just mention two of them: global public health and artificial intelligence. That's actually, these two are related, because it's been announced recently that AI is capable of creating killer strains of bacteria that will make something like COVID look like child's play. We really need to work together as a global community with a shared future, or we're not going to have a shared future.
Then, Harvey, based on your observation, how have the affected 30 universities and broader higher education community responded to this policy?
Well, of course, not very happily, especially with a deadline of 2 weeks, which is an outrageous and ridiculous deadline, because they're asking the universities to do a month or a year's worth of data gathering in just a few hours. And so the universities are generally concerned. They're concerned about academic freedom. They're concerned about international collaborations, which have been very robust in the last decades, not only with China, but with other countries. And so the universities are very worried about this. And I believe that some of these universities are targeted because Trump hates them. So take Harvard. I went to Harvard. I worked hard to get in. Jared Kushner bought his way in. Trump couldn't even buy his way in. And I think part of it is the personal animus, which tends to run with President Trump in a lot of the decisions that he makes. They're not rational decisions, they're emotional decisions. I think the universities are very worried, and they should be. But I think that they'll take steps to protect the national interest while also protecting academic freedom and international cooperation, as they should.
As you said, within 2 weeks, the deadline is on August 31st. Could you elaborate more on what practical challenges will they face in conducting those audits and potentially restructuring their partnerships within such a short period of time?
I think it'll be impossible. And I think the deadline was made so it's impossible. Probably some of this is driven by the so-called U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, Pete Hegseth used to be a Fox News commentator. His only skill is knowing how to read or misread a teleprompter. And so we have somebody who's ill-equipped running these policies for President Trump. And so it's going to make it very difficult. So it's impossible, and probably purposefully impossible, to set a 2-week deadline. There's no way universities can answer these kinds of inquiries. They're either going to have to get an extension, or they're going to have to push back through the court system, through the legal system. I don't know how it's going to end, but what they're doing basically is they're disrupting the normal work of these great universities and trying to sideline them to U.S. benefit at China's expense. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong-headed. And I think we need to cooperate on existential global issues, not to build walls between us.
So could such policy force universities to choose between government support and global scientific collaboration? I mean, in the long term, how might this affect the competitiveness of American higher education, scientific innovation, and talent attraction?
I think we can need to look at the short term and the long term. In the short term, I think it's going to affect it very, very significantly, because the universities will be constrained in what they can do and the cooperations that they can run with China and other countries. In the long term, it's the crystal ball is a little bit more clouded. It's clouded because we don't know what the political makeup is going to be after the November congressional elections, nor the presidential elections in 2 years. But I would say that the universities have to hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and they're going to have to take steps immediately to try to temporarily shore up their funding, because money is the lifeblood of research, and the Defense Department and the U.S. government holds a huge stick to the recipients of these funds. It's designed really to maybe negate a lot of the work of these universities, and certainly to negate the cooperation between U.S. And China. And I find this very, very strange, coming just a few weeks before President Xi and President Trump are supposed to meet at a summit. It's really mind-boggling.
And lastly, Harvey, looking ahead, how might the growing trend of securitizing scientific cooperation reshape the global innovation system? And how should countries strike a balance between protecting research security and maintaining openness, trust, and international collaboration?
That's a really important question, and it's the question. It's how do we go forward? It's absolutely necessary for every country to protect its national interests, especially when it comes to security issues. So there's definite red lines that we know exist in every country. People don't want to share defense secrets and things like that. And so that's perfectly understandable. It's been the case throughout history. But where the line should be drawn is by trying to come up with rules of engagement between the various countries involved that allow for legitimate scientific research that moves the ball forward without getting into intelligence matters and things that are either intellectual property secrets or trade secrets or things like that. So I hope that in the summit that President Xi and President Trump can develop some of these borders and lines that will sandbox in some of the problematic issues, but allow the bulk of the research to continue for the sake of all humanity.
That's Harvey Zoding, former vice president of ABC TV network. Coming up, China and Australia expand a currency swap agreement. This is World Today. We'll be back. You've been listening to World Today with me, Anna, in Beijing. The central banks of China and Australia have renewed their bilateral local currency swap agreement for another 5 years. The two sides also expanded the swap arrangement to 220 billion yuan, or about 46 billion Australian dollars. The People's Bank of China said the move will further deepen bilateral monetary and financial cooperation. First established in 2012, the swap arrangement has been renewed regularly, including in 2021 when it was extended for another 5 years. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
It's a pleasure.
Professor, this looks like routine business with the swap arrangement renewed every 5 years. But given the ups and downs in China-Australia relations, including Australia's restriction on Chinese investment in critical minerals and its alignment with Washington's so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, is this really just a routine, especially from Australia's perspective?
Look, there's always something quite interesting about the relationship between the economic interactions of countries and the nature of their diplomatic relationships. In fact, there's quite a body of research which suggests that trade relationships are largely unaffected by the ebbs and flows of the diplomatic relationships, in large part because trade relationships are quite sticky. And they take a long time to develop, and companies are very reluctant to drop them just because there is a particular diplomatic incident. They hope that the politicians can work through that. So the economic issues continue to sort of grind away in the background. And I think one of the things we can say about this is that in large part, it is a recognition of fundamental economic reality. So it is business as usual to the extent that it seeks to ensure continuity rather than disruption. So far this year, for example, we've seen bilateral goods trade between China and Australia reach something like 131.5 billion US dollars, up 37% year on year. And that's quite significant. Chinese imports from Australia is up 45% year on year. So the complementarity, the ongoing trading relationships really call for a need to maintain institutional stability, and currency swap arrangements is part and parcel of ensuring that overnight settlements between the central banks of the trading countries can actually be undertaken. So I would say that by and large it is business as usual because business must continue. Mm-hmm. The second issue that you touched on is the wider context, and I think it is worth noting that RMB internationalisation continues to unfold, and the fact that the RBA in Australia went down this path does align this particular extension and expansion of the swap line with the wider pattern of RMB internationalisation.
Speaking of economic and trade reality, the swap agreement has been expanded by 10% from 200 billion to 220 billion yuan. How do you read this increase behind this routine business?
Well, it reflects the fact that trade continues to grow. The volume of trade continues to grow, number one. And number two, that there is an expectation that trade will continue to also grow into the future. The other thing, as I mentioned, is this process of progressive RMB internationalisation. And we are aware that the instances in which Australian and Chinese trading partners have agreed to settle accounts in RMB is beginning to grow. It's a relatively modest part of the overall trade relationships, but it's certainly one that is likely to grow. We know, for example, of the agreements for pricing and settling iron ore trade in RMB in part, and that's an important step towards RMB internationalisation. We also know that the regional supply chains throughout Southeast Asia, and let's not forget Australia of course, is deeply enmeshed into trading with Southeast Asian nations as well. This Southeast Asian development is in large part connected to the diversification of Chinese companies throughout the region and the deepening of supply chain connections. And when Australian companies begin to do more business with Chinese companies domiciled in Southeast Asia, it is possible, though it's not necessary, but it is possible that the trade that they do with each other can also be settled in RMB. So the processes of internationalisation of the RMB is well supported by this expansion and extension of the swap arrangements between the RBA in Australia and the PBOC.
Professor, we know back in 2022, one notable development was Australian iron ore producer settling some trade with China in Chinese yuan. At that time, Australian media debated whether Australia was trying to reduce its reliance on the US dollar. Do you see this as a broader trend that Australia is seeking to diversify its exposure to the US dollar and reduce its reliance on a single currency for trade and finance? Or is it simply a practical response to the scale of China-Australia trade?
Well, a bit of both, of course. Let's not forget that trade with China represents about a third of Australia's trade. So it's a very significant proportion in any regard. And the Australian dollar is one of the most traded and speculated upon currencies globally, which means that it does have a tendency to be susceptible to the ebbs and flows of currency trading and the effects that that has on relative currency values. From the point of view of long-term contracting and stabilizing business relationships, being able to more effectively manage foreign exchange risks is an important consideration. And if countries are better positioned to engage in trade and settle trade accounts through the use of national currencies, it certainly contributes towards addressing foreign exchange fluctuation risks. I think that's part of the consideration, without a doubt. And Australia is continuing to keep an eye out for the transformations that are taking place in the critical economic relationships that it relies upon. And that is not only with China, but it's also with Southeast Asia. And as RMB internationalisation and Chinese enterprises and foreign direct investment enrich and deepen the China-Southeast Asian connectivity, it's inevitable that more and more trade will be settled in national currencies. And Australia, I think, whilst it doesn't make a big deal of it explicitly, behind the scenes, it would certainly be thinking that it needs to at least take early steps to prepare.
Professor, one last question. More broadly, China has recently renewed or expanded local currency swap arrangements with many countries, including Malaysia, Kazakhstan, and Argentina. Are we seeing a broader shift toward greater use of local currencies in international trade and finance? And how do you see RMB's role in this realm?
The short answer is yes. The last few years in particular has seen the acceleration of the use of national currencies in trade settlements. The RMB itself is used to settle about half or a little bit more than half of China's own trade these days, which is significant. We know from the experiences of sanctioned countries such as Russia and Iran that they are able to continue and sustain growing trade relationships with other countries, provided that they're willing to transact with each other outside of the weaponized SWIFT US dollar system. So, yes, there is a broad pattern of national currency expansion, what I call currency multipolarity. We're seeing the renewal and expansion of swap arrangements, of course. But the other thing to keep an eye on is the fact that many countries and their central banks, as well as private corporations, are now issuing RMB-denominated bonds because they are seeking to increase their holdings of RMB so as to be able to move forward with RMB-denominated trade and ultimately also RMB-denominated investments.
Thanks, Professor, for those valuable insights. That was Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
Welcome back to World Today. The U.S. national debt has surpassed 40 trillion U.S. dollars for the first time. According to the U.S. Treasury, debt held by the public stands at more than $32 trillion, while intragovernmental holdings account for nearly $8 trillion. The milestone came months earlier than expected, reflecting persistent federal budget deficits, with government spending continuing to outpace revenue. The ballooning debt has raised concerns in financial markets and put upward pressure on Treasury yields, while rising interest payments are adding further strain to the federal budget. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Professor Muhammad Ali Nasir, Professor of Economics at University of Leeds. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, the U.S. national debt has surpassed 40 trillion U.S. dollars for the first time. How serious is this milestone? Is the headline number itself the problem, or does it point to deeper structural weaknesses in the U.S. economy?
It's a major milestone that the U.S. national debt has surpassed 40 trillion U.S. dollar landmark. Itself is a figure which has a significance. It's a major milestone. No country has held this much debt ever before. But it also shows some other rather more worrying things and worrying signs. One is the underlying structural weakness of the U.S. economy, and other is the velocity of debt and the speed at which this debt balloon is getting bigger and bigger. If we just look at just a few months ago, it was 39 trillion, and now it has exceeded 40 trillion just in a matter of about 5 or 6 months. And if we look back just less than a decade ago, it was 20 trillion. So the debt has doubled in less than 10 years. This is really a worrying sign. And on top of that, of course, if you are holding that much debt in excess of 40 trillion US dollar, the interest payments, they are over 1.1 trillion US dollar annually. So it's a large amount of money is spent on just paying your existing debt, the interest on that. And of course, that means you would have less money to spend elsewhere, and a big chunk of your total spending goes into areas which are mandatory spending programs rather than things which could be maybe more related to investment and related to future growth. Mm-hmm. So there are many long-term economic consequences which are linked to this massive debt that the US has accumulated. Large public debt leads to crowding out the private investment. When the debt levels are so high, government is borrowing a lot, so it is worth lending to the government than investing in private sector, which is also a bad thing. So the public debt crowds out the private investment. There could also be inflationary pressures. It also put a restraint on the U.S. ability to spend elsewhere where it is needed. So it reduces the fiscal flexibility the U.S. has. And also there are legal issues which we could see. For instance, in next year, there is a real risk that the U.S. may breach the debt limit which it has, the statutory debt limit, that is quite likely would be breached, and that is of about just over 41 trillion US dollars. So it might be that the US breach that limit. So there are many consequences of this huge level of debt which the US has amounted.
That's indeed alarming, but why has Washington been unable or unwilling to bring its fiscal deficit under control?
Yes, I mean there are some challenges. One is that if you want to reduce the debt, what you got to do is you got to reduce your spending and you got to increase your taxation. The thing is that in the US, that is very difficult to do due to the type of politics they have in the US. So, for instance, the Republican Party very often they focus on the cutting taxes, like Mr. Trump has done, whereas the Democrats they are usually into spending more on social benefits and healthcare and elsewhere. So usually you find an agreement or consensus where you are spending more and taxing less, which makes both parties happy. But then it leads to ever increasing the debt, ever increasing the deficit, and ever increasing payments on the interest on the debt which you have accumulated. So, therefore, that's the story of the US public finances in the last few years that we have increasing debt, increasing deficit, and increasing payments on interest, which is on the debt which you have accumulated, and the investments are not made in the areas where they very much need it. But that is the part and parcel of the US political system. And so far, none of the major parties have shown any interest to change that.
We know the dollar is the world's dominant reserve currency, but how much longer can Washington rely on this exorbitant privilege if countries are increasingly diversifying their reserves and reducing their exposure to U.S. assets?
Yes, the US dollar has what we call exuberant privilege that US can borrow in its own currency, and the US dollar is also is an international currency, it's a reserve currency which has been used. And on one hand, it has led US to borrow a lot over the years. Now you ask me the question that how long it could go on. I mean, we don't really see in the near future there is a major threat to the exuberant privilege US has enjoyed. However, there is a gradual erosion of that. I mean, if we look at the, for instance, the reserve status of the US dollar, over the last few years, we see there is not sharp but gradual decline of the US treasuries and the US dollars being used as a reserve currency from around 70% around 20, 25 years ago to now it stands about 56 to 57%. So there is a gradual decline in that. And we also see that now then the yield on the treasuries there is in excess of 5%, which is highest in the last 20 years. So which means the investors are saying, okay, well, you got to pay more to us to lend you the money. So there are some signs around that. And we also see that there's a weaponization backlash where the US has used its position as a dominant currency and exuberance privilege to punish some of the countries like freezing the the Russian assets and some other countries' assets where whenever it wanted. So there is a little bit of backlash towards that. So we do see in the coming years the exuberance privilege will decrease to some extent, but this decrease is gradual over a period of time. But like things like increase in the debt to this level would definitely speed up that process.
Thanks, Professor, for those insightful explanation. That was Professor Muhammad Ali Nasir, Professor of Economics at University of Leeds.
Hello, I am Dr. Digby James Wren, a political analyst and international relations scholar specializing in China area studies. World Today offers unmatched in-depth perspectives on China's politics, economics, business, technology and society. World Today's team of reporters and contributors provides valuable information from all of the world's major economies. I hope you can join me on World Today for the very best insights and news from China, on China, and help to build a better understanding of China's role in the world today.
You've been listening to World Today. Nearly 300 million moviegoers have hit Chinese cinemas this summer, with more than 34 million screenings recorded, both setting new records for the season. Daily box office revenue has topped $15 million for 40 consecutive days, while the average movie ticket price has fallen to a 5-year low. Meanwhile, Film Plus consumer activities are expanding, with the total output value of China's film industry chain exceeding $60 billion this year. So for more on this, my colleague Lin Qingxuan spoke with Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation.
Chinese-produced films have dominated the 2026 summer box office, taking 4 of the top 5 spots. What's your interpretation of this result or outcome?
So I think that China's movies really are playing quite good this time for this summer. This is a reflection of many different factors, including the quality of these films and also the competitors' films. I don't think that China's movie industry is leading the world, but we really are able to try to do more innovation to do with the taste of the Chinese people. So among those films, I know that there are quite some of those cartoon films, and I would say that is also a reflection about some of these cultures and also our taste of these people. So I think that performance is pretty good, but I don't think that is a total story. Maybe we can look more for the later performance of the other films.
This summer, the average ticket price fell 2.4% year-on-year, while cinema attendance increased 5.7%, significantly outpacing box office growth. So how do you assess the strategy of lowering ticket prices to boost attendance?
Well, it's usually the truth that when the people are facing lower prices and lower costs, they will try to consume more. So it is a law in the economies about how people are having the choices based on their demand. Well, lower costs definitely are good reasons why the people are able to go to the cinema, but I don't think that is the whole picture because the 2.4% is not a pretty high, especially when you are comparing that kind of range with the inflation rate. So it's almost the similar compared with the last year, a little bit more about 1 point, but not that much. So I think that the main reasons why more attendance from the people to the cinemas is that they're enjoying this context of these films and they really want to bring their family to enjoy this time together. And I would say that also are having some reasons to do with the development of the industries in the cinemas when they are able to provide a better treatment for the people who are going to watch the movies and also to provide them with a better performance on the goods and some of these foods in the cinemas.
Third and fourth tier cities accounted for about 36% of this summer's box office, with some cities recording year-on-year growth of more than 20%. So how do you see the changing role of lower-tier cities in China's film industry, and what further growth potential do they have?
Well, it's interesting because we just published our documents to guide the development of the consumption in the lower tier cities. I think that it's are really vast areas for the potential increase of the consumption. There are so many people living in these areas, and the range of these areas accounted for more than 90% of our territory of China. So they have much more possibilities. And the movies doesn't have to be the brand is new, and they can be some movies maybe casted several years ago. I think that we have the choices made by the consumers themselves. So we are going to support the provider of these services, especially for the entertainment, to more people in the villages or in the third or fourth tier cities. And also the cinemas are being built. It is one of the key factors when we are saying more consumptions in those areas. And I mean, many people are really want to try different lifestyle. Maybe they are having more choices, even they are living in the third or fourth tier cities in China.
Another thing worth noting is that China's overseas box office surpassed 1.39 billion US dollars in 2025, and 15 of the top 20 Chinese films were released overseas. So what can be done to further promote high-quality Chinese films in international markets?
Well, it is a very interesting question because in the past, when talking about the films, many people are thinking of for the Hollywood and also the Western styles movies because they want to trying to taste the culture in other countries. Well, nowadays we are seeing that these things has been go to another direction. Many Chinese cultures are embedded in the movies and they are being interested by the foreign people, foreign audience. So I think that if we are going to support the internationalization of the Chinese movies, we need to know more about what the foreign people really expect to have from watching the movies. Sometimes in the past, they want to see the very bad areas of China, like the poverty, like the poor, like some of the bad things happening in China's society. But now, I think that they really want to look at China's historical many interesting things like the cultures and also some of these modern areas like the leading technology and some of this exploration for the new fields. So if we are going to give the world more understanding about China's society and China's culture, I think that we need to try to know the ways of expressing that. And we may need to try to have these stories coming from China's and the foreign directors together. We can do more to meet the more diversified market, but I think that we still need to go from one step to another, maybe starting from some of these places where many Chinese people are living.
And nowadays, many local governments are promoting Film Plus initiatives. So how can this deeper cross-industry collaboration turn film-driven traffic into longer-term economic value?
Well, that is interesting ways of trying to add more value added to the films, to the entertainment. So I think that consumptions should be met not just in one way. We can try to give the people more reasons if they are going to go to the cinemas. They like what we have just watched the movies when they're talking about some stories from the Oxys, coming from two people. I think that when the people are going to the cinemas in that movie, they are talking with each other and they are laughing. They are doing some kind of communications. So the movies can be more developed into different ways when people are enjoying the time when there's events in the cinemas. And I think that it can also combine with some other performance. So it's not just people sitting there to watch movies. It can also be part of that kind of entertainment activities. And this can be also followed by the restaurants or other kind of views in different places. So we can do more to improve ways of entertainment in the cinemas and other areas to combine these things together.
That was Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, talking with my colleague Lian Qingxuan. That's all the time for this edition of World Today with me, Anna. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.